pull up the slide. Thank you for doing the recording there. And let's see here. I'll push this onto slideshow, and hopefully everybody can see me at home. Everybody can hear us at home. So welcome everybody at home. We have with us tonight an amazing guest speaker. We're so excited to have her here. Her name is Anusha Kakani, and she is a mentor here at the Rec Innovation Lab. This is actually her first semester as a mentor here, and this is our first workshop here together. So we're really excited to hear from her all about funding for early stage startups. So during the workshop, so the workshop goes until about 6:50 p.m. And if you have any questions along the way, please put your questions in the chat. If you have just a burning desire to ask a question, you can let us know, and we'll try to get them addressed. But probably the best way is just to put them in the chat. Please turn off your cameras and microphones during the workshops, because there are a lot of people joining from remotely, and so we don't want people talking over each other or anything like this. And we should be good to go. Welcome to the Rec. I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you for coming, and welcome. All yours.
Thank you. So if I stand here, I'm on the camera, but I might be blocking the slides.
Yeah, so
maybe I'll like
stand over here. Yeah, let's see here.
Yeah,
see if we can better. And everybody from home, you can hear us all right. You can see us all right. All right.
Yes.
So, I don't know if that's so dark for some reason. It's really dark, but that's okay. We can see you. We know you're there. We know you're there. All right. And you should be able to now just click on that. So you should be able to go forward and back.
Perfect.
All right. So perfect. It's all you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Anusha Kakani. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about early stage funding and the legal nuts and bolts around what that means. And my name is Anusha Kakani. I'm one of the founding partners of Radical Law. To tell you a little bit about Radical Law, we're a boutique corporate law firm. We're focused on get rid of this for 1 second.
Yeah, I was gonna say, here, I can get rid of this here for you. Here, let's get this here, and we get all these people in so it's not in the way. We close out of that and close out of that so it's not in the way. Is that good?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Great. So Radical Law is a There we go. Okay. Yes. So Radical Law is a corporate law firm. We're focused on social impact, and we integrate emerging sustainability and social equity frameworks across diverse industries, including emerging technologies like deep tech and AI, as well as blockchain, cryptocurrency, finance, holistic health and wellness, psychedelics, and more. Both my partner and I, we are Harvard Law educated and Big Law trained, and we left Big Law. We wanted to be here for our entrepreneurs, our founders, our small businesses that we believe very much is the fabric of our society. So today I'm really excited to talk to everybody here about how do you set yourself up for success when it comes to early stage funding? Because early stage funding can really make or break your company. And so what are the things that we need to talk about and to consider so that you're properly thinking about how you're going to grow your company and what that's going to take? So to discuss all of that, we're going to first talk about how do you find the right fundraising strategy for your company? Then we're going to talk about what is equity? What does that even mean? What is a capitalization table or a cap table? You're going to hear me say that a ton today. So we're going to dig into what that really means. Today's lecture is really going to focus on the typical emerging company venture capital growth strategy. Of course, there are going to be a lot of businesses that don't go that way, and I'll touch on some of the alternatives that we're seeing emerging as well. But for the most part, we're really going to talk about sort of what you hear like pre-seed, Series A, Series B, like sort of demystify that. What does all that mean? And in order to do that, we have to really talk about what is preferred equity. And then we're going to end with some takeaways for founders.
Anusha, I don't mean to interrupt, but I was gonna say, if you want to stand away from the light, I'd be happy to stand over here too for you. I don't know if does it feel like it's in your face a little bit, or, I mean, are you more comfortable? Are you good?
Yeah, this is great.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah,
so you can just point at me when you want me to.
Yes.
to switch.
Cool.
Okay,
We can go to the next.
wonderful. And I went too many. Perfect, right there?
I
One
think
back.
one back.
Oh,
Yes.
I'm not much help. I'm not much
So
help.
initial funding, I think a lot of people here have probably already started a company, right? Show of hands, how many people already formed your company? Awesome. So if you formed your company, that means more than likely you have some sort of starting capital. A lot of times companies are formed by starting capital that's contributed by their founders. So founders will get some sort of equity, and in exchange for that equity, they'll pay a very nominal price, usually like par value, or sometimes equity can be issued in exchange for services or in exchange for IP. So what when we're talking about the starting capital, it's like a very, very small amount, right? It doesn't really give you a lot of runway. I've heard of founders that have like sold their house and then put all their savings in their new business.
Yeah.
True story, it happens. And while that will give you probably runway to do maybe your first exploration to like what is going to be your product or what is going to be your service, it's not going to really give you that runway you need to grow your business. So what is the additional early funding people typically look towards? These are personal loans, like, going to your parents, going to your family members. There's commercial loans. These haven't been great because, you pay a lot of interest, they end up being really costly. And then there's the other really common thing you'll hear is like the friends and family round. And we'll dig into this a little bit more too, but typically you're talking about what's known as a SAFE, simple agreement for future equity, or a convertible note. These are agreements that you enter into now to issue equity at a later time, because you might not be at the position right away where you're willing to issue equity and dilute yourself. So early stage, these are typically the ways that you'll initially see companies will capitalize. But oftentimes this isn't really enough. So what's next? How do you set your fundraising strategy? So there's going to be a few things that you want to consider, right? So let's talk about these icons up here. Time, right? How quickly do you want to grow? What are going to be your important milestones, right? The puzzle pieces. What are all the different pieces that you need to come together? So for example, if you're a medical corporation, maybe you need some regulatory licenses, or if you're in biotech, right? IP is another important piece that you need to consider. So there's a bunch of pieces that are going to make your growth strategy all come together. Then what is your scaling strategy? And lastly, are you going to have to hire people? Are you going to have to build out a team? So all of these are important considerations. What is your entity type? Do you have a corporation or an LLC? There's also other entity types. Most recently, if you hear about impact investing, a lot of companies can have like a stated public benefit. And so you could be a public benefit corporation. My company is a law firm. It's a partnership. That's a different type of entity. You can also have nonprofits, although we won't get into that kind of funding here because nonprofits have no ownership, so to speak of. So but that being said, you can also, have nonprofits can also get funding, right? There's also some other restrictions, for example, professional corporations. So if you're in the healthcare space, like if you're a doctor, for example, and you want to set up a clinical practice, your practice can only be owned by the same kind of licensed doctor, usually. Same thing for lawyers. A law firm can only be owned by a lawyer. If you've got certain restrictions on who can own your entity, that's going to restrict what you can do with your equity, aka who can you offer your equity to. The other thing to consider is, what are your goals for your business? What do you want the ownership of your business to look like? For some people, it's very clear. They're like, this is going to be a mom and pop shop. It's going to be owned by me forever, for the rest of eternity, right? So in that case, maybe this kind of fundraising strategy isn't right for you. But if you're going to be having the kind of business that's going to require a lot of capital, where are you going to get that capital from? And what are people going to be willing to give you that capital for? Those are the honest conversations you have to understand, okay, well, maybe then I do need to be willing to give away equity in order to raise money for my growth strategy. Who are your investors? Are they individuals? Are they institutional investors? And this is the last thing I'm going to say is, like, what is your exit strategy? And it's crazy to think, like, do I really have to be thinking about that early on? But the truth is yes, because ultimately, whatever value you capture in your company, whatever that equity is referring to, your stockholders' equity, your shareholders' value, how do you ultimately get that value? Either your company is going to IPO or go public, or you're going to have some sort of a sale or a merger. It's cut off, but that should say private equity or venture capital. So typically, when you have this exit is when you're going to make that, when you're actually going to see that return on your investment, right? So you have to start thinking about what is your exit strategy and accordingly build out your fundraising strategy. So what is equity? I've been saying the word equity a lot, and we hear the word equity a lot too, right? We hear like diversity, equity, inclusion. That kind of equity is referring to fairness. That is not the equity we're talking about here. The equity we're talking about is equity that is ownership interest in a company. So how many people have seen Shark Tank? Yeah, so you always hear, right? 5% at something valuation, right? So your equity, your ownership interest in a company is what they're essentially talking about. They're saying 5% ownership stake, that's equity that they're referring to. Equity in an LLC typically is represented by membership interests, units or percentages. And in a corporation, equity is represented by stock. So you hear the terms common stock, preferred stock. So if you have an LLC versus a corporation, the underlying equity is slightly different. So this graphic here, what that's meant to say is the idea is as your company grows in value, that's your equity growing in value as well. So your equity is determined by what is the whole value of the company, and then divide that by your percentage of what you own. That's like your stake of the company. The other important thing to remember about equity is that equity is a security. So if you're working with any startup lawyers for your initial fundraisers, you need to also make sure they understand securities law and that you're complying with securities law, because you are subject to federal and state securities law for any and all equity that you issue. And all sales of securities, including for common stock, preferred stock, for LLC membership interests, either have to be registered or they have to be sold or issued pursuant to an exemption from registration. So commonly, under SEC rules, there's section 482, section 482, which applies to founder stock and other service providers. There's also other exemptions for private placements. The most common one you'll hear a lot is Reg D. If you hear about people going out and they're asking, are you an accredited investor, right? That status of accredited investor, that definition is put forth by the SEC. And if you meet that definition, then a company can raise from you as an investor, and it will fall under the Reg D safe harbor. So this is, I'm oversimplifying, but the idea is that there are ways you can raise money, but you need to be careful and make sure that you're following the rules when you do it. So we've talked about equity, but to really understand what equity means, we have to understand what equity is in the context of a cap table. So earlier I was talking about sort of thinking about your equity ownership as a stake, right? So the best way to think about it, I always use a pizza pie analogy. I feel really bad for people on the West Coast because I'm originally from the East Coast, and New Jersey, New York has really, really good pizza. And I'm sorry, but there's just not as good pizza out here. So we'll just imagine that really good New York pie, right? That big New York pie. And your equity, right? What you own is a function of what everybody else owns. So I'll give you an example. When you initially purchase your equity, you might be purchasing only one slice, right? Let's say 10,000 common shares, or common stock. Whatever you're purchasing, it's a hard number, right? You're purchasing 1 or 1,000 or 100, whatever it is, right? You're purchasing one slice. Your slice, what percentage that is, depends on what everybody else has, right? So when I'm purchasing, this is just a snapshot in time. So let's say when I'm purchasing this slice, I'm a 15% owner of the company, right? Then next week, the company goes and issues more stock to other people. Suddenly, if you look at my slice in relation to everybody else's, I'm no longer at 15%, right? I'll be at 10% or maybe even 5%, depending on what everybody else has. And that is the most important thing to understand about equity. When you're purchasing, it's like a snapshot. But then as the company is growing, as you're inviting more equity holders, your equity starts to get diluted. And same thing with the investor, right? So that's the trick to understanding cap tables. So the cap table will have a list of all of your equity holders. It'll say, oh, this person owns and we'll see an example later, but 1 million shares, right? And so let's say your total is 10 million shares. Then it'll show that that person owns 10% of your company. A fully diluted cap table, basically if there's preferred equity, there's common equity, you put everything on a one-to-one basis, and that will show you who has the ownership of the company at what percentage at the end of the day, right? So what's tricky about cap table management is something like a safe or convertible note that you might issue early on. Technically, those people are not equity holders yet, right? It'll be like a separate page on your cap table that'll list out your safes and your convertible notes, but that percentage won't be in your cap table. So you need to keep those in mind because that's future dilution that's actually not even on your cap table yet, but it'll appear on your cap table when that equity converts at your Series A or whatever it might be. The other thing to keep in mind is like vested and unvested equity. A lot of people will issue equity up front and then we'll say, okay, this is subject to vesting over 4 years. So in the company's mind, there's protection. They're like, okay, well, if this person walks away before their equity vests, at least I can, get that equity back. And while that's true, the company can repurchase equity from a service provider if they leave, for example, before the shares have vested. The tricky thing is in a fully diluted cap table, all of your unvested equity is actually considered outstanding. So you need to keep that in mind too, is that yes, that stock is restricted, but it's issued and outstanding for purposes of figuring out everyone's like equity percentages. The other thing is voting rights and thresholds. So sometimes if you issue preferred equity, for example, or sometimes even in a state, I've seen like side letters with voting rights. And that's not going to be captured on your cap table, right? So somebody that might have a minority stake might still have a very important voting right that's not necessarily on your cap table. So this is why ultimately a cap table, this graphic is meant to represent that it's going to really show you what happens to the capital coming into the company and who's going to be getting the payout according to what percentages, how capital is going to go out of the company. And this, as I said, represents sort of that pie analogy that I was using earlier. So this is the typical emerging company VC strategy that you hear of, right? So initially, when you're at your idea stage, that's like your pre-seed stage. Sometimes people call that seed as well. We're talking about your founder stock issuing to yourself, your founding team, potentially doing some safes or convertible notes. And that should get you enough runway to your price round. How do you do your first price round? And what is a price round? A price round means that you're actually pricing this preferred equity. So when people say Series A, what they're actually referring to is a title of a preferred equity. And we're going to get into what that means in just a second. But a couple of things I want you guys to take away from this is investors are actually coming up for a fair market value price for what they think your stock is actually worth. So this is your price round is the first time that you're actually pricing your equity. You're saying this is the value of our company. So for example, a share of Series A preferred stock might be worth $1.30, right? And then you extrapolate that to see, okay, what is the value of your company? The way investors and companies come to that value is through different financial tests. Like they might look at EBITDA, they might look at other values for shareholder equity in your financials, and they'll sort of negotiate and come to a price. Based on that price round, investors will invest money, and then that money is supposed to give you runway. Sometimes specific milestones or targets are actually negotiated. They'll say, okay, with this money that we're giving you, you need to achieve so and so and so. And then maybe they'll give you a little bit more money, right? So there might be additional closings, milestone closings, but the idea is whatever you do at your price round, whatever you're saying to investors, hey, we need $5 million for 12 months of runway. So that's supposed to get you through those 12 months, whatever that milestone might be, like, hey, we're getting our MVP, we're launching our pilot, we're going to be scaling to this state, whatever that milestone might be. And then once you hit that runway, when you've sort of reached the end of that runway, then the typical approach is you need to then start fundraising for your next price round, a Series B. Now, there are things you can do in between, like you can do bridge loans, you can do convertible note financings that then convert at the next round. So there are options, but this is pretty typically the path that companies will follow. And then eventually they'll do a Series C. They might do a Series D. At some point, they might have a merger or a sale event. But eventually, if they continue like this, the idea is then they'll IPO, an initial public offering, which means, then your equity is offered to the public. And then that's like the big payout for a lot of the early investors. So what is preferred equity? So when you hear Series A, Series B, Series C, what that's referring to is an agreement that when an investor invests in your company, they're going to get preferred stock, which gives them preferential rights over other common stockholders in exchange for investing capital into your company. It's a recognition that, hey, they're taking a risk. They need a return on their investment. But how do they protect that investment, right? It's one thing to be like, hey, give me $2 million and I'll give you some sort of return on your investment. How is that investor going to actually know, right? Or feel secure that they can actually make that return? And the way that the transactions have developed is that these investors end up getting these kinds of preferred rights. So they'll have financial and economic rights. So typically this is referred to as like a liquidation preference. What that means is if there is some sort of a liquidity event, like they actually get a preference. So what that means is, let's say you sell your company, or for some reason there's a bankruptcy or you go under. Preferred stockholders get first dibs over common stockholders. So let's say you're a common stockholder as a founder. A lot of times founder stock, you have common stock. Investor comes in, they have preferred stock, and you go under or you sell your company, the preferred stockholders get their return first, and then the common stockholders can get their return. So it protects them in case there is a sale or there's some kind of liquidity. The other way that they protect themselves is through management rights. So typically in all corporations, shareholders elect the directors, but these investors can actually negotiate for designated board seats. So they'll say, okay, I'm giving you $2 million. So for that, I need a board seat. And they get to designate who goes on that board. That's your company. Sure, you're the founder. You may be the CEO. You may be on the board as well, but they also can get a seat, potentially even two. So these are the kinds of things that get negotiated. Sometimes if they don't get a board seat, they get board observer seats, which means they'll say, hey, in all of your board meetings, we get an observer that comes and they get to know what's going on. They might not get voting rights, but at least they understand what's going on. There's a bunch of voting rights that are also negotiated at a preferred equity round. So these are things, there's a list that goes basically in your certificate of incorporation. It's called protective provisions. And what they say is, okay, you need a majority of preferred A series holders consent before you change your line of business, before you take a loan on that's over a certain threshold, before you bring on a new CEO, or so there can be a bunch of things that or before you issue more equity that dilutes the Series A holders, for example, before you do a Series B or issue any kind of equity that might be more preferential to the Series A. So there's a bunch of protections that they usually negotiate for. And then these include co-sale and drag-along rights. So this is also something really important to understand. When you onboard an investor and they have these kinds of co-sale and drag-along rights, what that means is when you do a transaction in the future, you're going to need them to sign up, right? Sign along to it. And then these kinds of rights also keep their equity protected. So let's say you as a founder or some third party wants to sell stock to an outsider, the investor can negotiate for a right of first refusal, which means instead of that person selling to a third party outside of the company, the investor can say, no, we get first dibs. You have to offer that to us first so that we get a chance to buy that equity. And the reason is that protects investors from future dilution or having outsiders in the company. And then there's also, it's cut off at the bottom, it says information rights. So typically, even if you do a SAFE or a convertible note, sometimes investors will say, hey, we want to see your quarterly financials. We want to see your annual financials. And so those are at a minimum what investors will request. So pre-seed funding. I think a lot of people here are super early, so I wanted to make sure we really talk about pre-seed funding. A SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity. What that is an agreement now to give you equity later. So typically an investor will say, hey, I'll give you, let's say $1 million, for example, now. And we don't have to worry about what that means in terms of equity now, right? Because you're so early, you don't really know what that's going to mean in terms of equity. So we'll kick that can down the road. So when you have your first price round, that's when my equity will get converted. And the mechanism by which you determine how much equity to give them is usually in the SAFE. It'll be either some sort of a discount. So whenever you do your price round and you determine whatever that is, these people will get a discount. So they'll get more shares for less money as opposed to the other people that are participating in that same price round. You could also use a valuation cap as another way to determine what price or how many shares you'll get. And so there's different ways to do it, but basically it's an investment now for equity later in the future. So it's an equity agreement. A convertible note is similar in the sense that you're getting cash upfront now from an investor, and it has the option to turn into equity later. But the main difference there is that it is a loan upfront, right? So it's going to have a maturity date So if it doesn't convert, then you have to repay the initial principal back. Whereas in a safe, it's more like if it doesn't convert, there's probably like a default of some reason for some reason. You also have to repay it, but it's not a loan. Whereas in a convertible note, it's usually there's a maturity date, there's usually interest. And so if it doesn't convert to equity, then you pay back as a loan, and it's booked on your financials as a loan as well. And then there's also conventional loans. I know a lot of people just take loans from friends and family, or they'll take loans from banks. I wanted to talk a little bit about friends and family because this really refers to one of those exemptions from registrations that I was referring to earlier under the SEC rules. And a lot of state securities laws have the same rule that say, if you go to your close friends and family, you can fundraise from them and you don't have to register the shares, which is like a huge expense. But the one thing I want to say here is I have seen friends and family be used really loosely. And in fact, if they're not really your friend and they're not really your family and they're not really somebody that you know, but rather somebody you met at like an investment conference and you're saying, hey, you want to join my friends and family round, doing something like that could actually invalidate the transaction. And the last thing you want to deal with is invalid equity. It is a huge problem. You can't really fix it. It's very complicated to fix. And so it's really important, if you're going to do a friends and family round, keep it friends and family. Otherwise, you should really only be going to accredited investors. You should only be relying on 482 or Reg D or one of those other exemptions from registration. So if anyone has questions specifically on like the nexus between fundraising and securities, more than happy to talk about that more. 482 is like another type of private placement, and Regulation D is a specific safe harbor within 482, which says that if you offer to accredited investors, you have a lot more flexibility. Whereas 482 doesn't actually require, like you can offer securities to unaccredited investors under 482 as long as they're sophisticated. But because there was a lot of questions on like, what does this actually mean? Like, does this mean I have to then go and do like a private placement memorandum and all of that, which is also like another big expense. Regulation D is a specific safe harbor that says if you're going to accredited investors and then you can actually raise like unlimited amount of money and all, you know, it makes it easier. So you've done your pre-seed funding, right? Maybe you've got some safes, you've got some convertible notes, you've got your founder's equity. Now you're ready to do your first price round. What does that look like? So this is just a random example I got off the internet. So first there's like something known as a pre-money valuation. So in this example, that's $3 million. Does anyone know what a pre-money valuation is? So basically what that means is that's your starting point before your first price round, right? So if you include your founder's equity, your operations, your revenues, all of that, you have to come up with some sort of a pre-money valuation that you agree upon with the investor, right? So that number is actually something that's negotiated and agreed upon. And then the investor says, okay, I'm going to put in $1 million. So if they put in $1 million, that makes your post-money valuation 4 million, because it's the 3 million that you started with plus your investment, that's your post money. So in another example, let's say your pre-money valuation is 5 million and you had two different investors putting in 5 million together, right? So, you know, 250,000 each, let's say. Sorry, 2.5 million each. Then you have 5 million. Then your post-money valuation is 10 million, right? 5 million plus your investment of 5 million, that's your post-money valuation. And the way that you calculate sort of what percentage is being issued and all of that will depend upon what is the ownership structure that you want the post money to reflect, right? So they almost start with like, they'll say, okay, we'll invest so-and-so $1 million for 25% of your company, right? So that's what this example is. And what that basically means is, you know, the founding team, only investor before, goes from 100% and they drop down to 75% because you've sold 25% for $1 million. So that's sort of how the cap table works generally. One thing you want to keep in mind is if you've had safes and convertible notes issued previously, this is when they would convert. So when you issue your first Series A preferred equity, that's when your safes and convertible notes convert as well. And they'll convert into what's known as a shadow series. So if you have Series A equity, your safes or convertibles, they'll usually convert at a lower price because there's usually some sort of a discount or a cap that's applied. And that's because, again, these safe and convertible note investors, they came in earlier, right? So they're coming in because they want some sort of an incentive for taking the risk and investing early. And that incentive is usually an economic incentive that gives them a discount. And so your Series A, so investor X, Y, and Z, they'll get Series A stock. If you have anyone who has safes or convertibles, they'll get like Series A-1 or A-2, because it's the same terms as your Series A, except they get that discount, right? So that's how the conversions usually happen.
I had a question.
Yeah.
There's a question online here. Is there anything that you can do to protect yourself from over dilution by raising capital?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, the most important thing you can do is issue yourself enough equity in the very beginning. So the way I've seen founders make the biggest mistake is, I'll use the example of a solo founder, for example. If you're a solo founder, you really should be owning 100% of your equity. And this is crazy for some people to hear, because they're like, oh, but then this guy helped me build my technology, so I wanted to give him a few percent. And then this guy helped me build my technologies, or did this, I wanted to give him a few percent. And, you know, I sort of call this like the super nice and eager founder problem. Like they really want to be, and it makes sense, because they're like, hey, like, I can't pay this person, so I'll just give them equity. But that's actually a big red flag to a lot of investors. Founders tend to think of like who deserves equity as like who put in the work. But investors think of equity as like who's putting in the capital and who deserves the payout, right? So there's a disconnect oftentimes between who a founder thinks belongs on the cap table versus who an investor belongs on the cap table. And so if you're early stage, you're a solo founder, or if you have a small team, you should be holding on to as much of that equity as possible and not really be giving it away. And I'll just give rough percentages here, but like typically advisors will get like 1% or 2% of equity, right? Service providers get like less than 1%. So if you're talking like, if anyone has like 5% or above, they're considered a significant shareholder. They're not a minor shareholder. Jumping to this over here, NVCA form documents, when you do your Series A, there is a set of documents that you have to enter into. So for example, your stock purchase agreement, that's going to list like who's buying what at what price. Your certificate of incorporation, as I mentioned, that's going to have a bunch of those protective provisions listed of like, you need consent from your preferred equity holders before you go out and do a bunch of different things, right? Similarly, there's a bunch of investor rights agreements, ROFR co-sale agreement, voting agreements. All of these will get signed up by preferred equity holders. And they're going to ask you at this time, when you sign all these up, they're going to say, hey, we want all of your other common stockholders or significant holders to also be bound by this, right? Because if they're saying, hey, we're going to invest capital, but that means that if there's a transaction in the future that we want to vote towards, if there's a sale, for example, that they really like, they want to be able to drag everybody else along with them. They're going to say, we need all of the other common stockholders to vote with us, right? And so if you think from an investor perspective, I've actually been on a deal that everything was ready to go. We were ready to get signed up. The investors say, we want 100% of all of your stockholders to sign up to all of these agreements. And the company is like, well, 12% of these people, we haven't spoken to them in years. We don't even know where they are. Like, but the investors were like, no, we need them to get signed up. So the deal actually was delayed until they found these stockholders and got all of those signatures. Because for investors, it's really important to maintain that level of control and that level of voting power. And so you have to be super careful with who you're giving equity to, because you have to be able to go and get signatures from them and get consents from them in the future as well. So, as we're ending here, I want to note that we've covered a lot, and what I really focused on was sort of like this emerging companies venture capital route with the Series A and the Series B and how early stage funding plays into all of that. But I want to note that our fundraising landscape is actually very dynamic, especially today. So here I've got a picture that's supposed to represent crowdfunding. How many people have heard of crowdfunding? It's quickly emerging. Yep, it's quickly emerging as an alternative to the regular funding route. That also does require SEC registration or exemption from registration. There's a whole Reg CF under SEC rules and regulations. But if you're working with one of the crowdfunding platforms, they a lot of times will take care of the reporting obligations for you. There's also a lot of entities that are being created as we speak. So Oregon, for example, last year allowed for a new entity type called the DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization. It's essentially a company that's built on the blockchain. And so it's using smart contracts to build this company. So all of your ownership, your governance and decisions are on the blockchain. So it's this decentralized, so there's no board.
Wow.
There's like, sure, there are shareholders in the sense that there's owners, but they're all on this decentralized network. So there's really cool, interesting things happening. One of the challenges is like, we can't quite get past like yes or no decisions. And so it's right now, these kinds of companies are really only being used as like subsidiaries for cryptocurrency or trading or those kinds of like quick decisions, but we haven't quite figured out how to do that for like governance and like really big questions. But still a really interesting landscape. And then these two graphics on the bottom, this is my passion. We're seeing a lot of like regenerative economic structures and hybrid structures. So for-profit and nonprofit elements combining to form some sort of a structure. There's also something known as blended finance, where you have like government grants, plus a combination of private sector, plus a combination of non-for-profit funding, and impact investing and ESG investing. So basically creating different innovative structures that not only prioritize a return on investment, but also the impact that they're supposed to be making for our planet. So things are constantly changing, new entity types, new innovative funding structures are coming about. So, you know, there are alternatives to what we just discussed as well. Great. And that was, I was told to leave 15 minutes at the end for questions. I think we're around 15 minutes. This is my partner and I again, Radical Law. And yeah, I'll open it up to questions now.
Thank you so much. All right, so I'll ask anybody from online too, if you want to put any questions in the chat. And then there were a couple of questions that we had that I wanted to ask from earlier. One of which was somebody had asked about like, when do you think a company is ready to go out and ask for funding? When are they ready for Series A? And I'll start with that question, then there's one other.
Yeah, so this is also one of those things that the answer is constantly changing. I think in the 90s and the dot-com boom when startup law really took off, the stories that I hear are like, you could go and fund an idea, right? Like you do your Series A. It was a lot of times it was like, I need funding so that I could go and try out this idea, right? So that I could see, can we build this? Can we do this? Today, it's not the idea anymore, it's traction. A lot of times I hear this word traction. So today investors are looking at, do you have a product? Are you generating revenue, or do you have traction, whatever that means? Meaning, do you have interest from other sort of investors, or do you have something that shows an investor like, hey, this isn't just an idea, this is something more, there's something proven or something that you've actually sort of flushed out here, right? And so that has changed, and it is harder to raise money today than it was, 20 years ago. And more investors are looking for companies to have done more by the time they get to that Series A stage. So that's why your early stage funding, like doing things like convertible notes rounds or safe rounds or friends and family rounds, a lot of that has really taken off because you're not able to get to that price round unless you have some sort of a product or some sort of a service or some sort of a proven market or traction. And they're like, okay, how do you get to that, right? So that's the question. Good.
So, we'll have yours and then I'll.
Well, you can go first. I was just gonna go ask if you can go back to the cap section where you showed the four, it's almost like a ladder.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, because, what did CAP stand for again?
Capital, venture capital. Sorry, it's cut off.
Oh,
there, but
venture capital.
venture capital, yeah. So if you're going to like a venture capital firm, they're the ones that'll come in sort of here at your price round. They'll be like your main institutional investors. This is like the typical path that you'll see.
So,
No.
go ahead, Greg. Okay, I was going to ask, so there was another question about when to look for different kinds of funding. Is there a particular type of funding that's best? And yeah, what should you go after and when?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the best kind of funding everyone will say is the non-dilutive funding, right? So if you are sort of, in the biotech space or something that's maybe in the public benefit space, maybe there's grants out there that you could get, right? So this is like another space where people are like, what's the best, right?
Yeah.
If you really want to not dilute yourself at all, right, that would be the best, is like some sort of non-dilutive funding. But
it's rare.
It's very rare. It's very rare. And I think expecting anyone to give you capital without them having some sort of protection or getting something in return is just, it's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough. So, you know, I think to answer that question, I think, yeah, it really depends. It really depends on each business, but, you know, I recently went to a conference where we learned about how women companies in particular tend to be bootstrapped for longer and women tend to pay themselves last. So there's also things like that that I don't want, you know, I think that's a common founder mistake as well, is like, you're so afraid to do that next step, to do that fundraiser, to take that external capital, that you're trying to do everything yourself. And I think that can also be a cause for problems and for failure. So it's a balance. And, you know, I think that's why, you know, Save's convertible notes, the big danger there is like you give away too much equity without realizing, because you've signed 10 safes and all of a sudden you didn't realize you actually gave away 20% of your company before you even did your first price round. So that's a big red flag as well. So I think knowing the economics, like making sure, that's, I think, the key is making sure what someone's offering to you, the amount is matching the equity that they're gonna get, right? Doing the math to make sure the economics actually work. That's the most important thing.
And it's such a tough, I feel like this is one of those decisions that's so difficult, because you want to hold off as long as you can so that you're not giving away your company if you don't have to. But at the same time, if you, I mean, why do you want to own 100% of a company that's only so big? If you could own 80% of a company that's 10 times as big, you know, you own so much more. So yeah, that's a tough one.
Back to non-dilutive.
Back to non-dilutive.
Non-dilutive is also scheduled. So quite honestly, most non-dilutive funding is only available on an annual basis.
You said it's scheduled?
It's scheduled. It's scheduled by the owner of the funding, like on an annual basis. So if you miss the window,
Oh.
another year. for it to
I
come
see what
back.
you're saying. I see what you're saying.
So it's
Yeah.
not as accessible as non-dilutive, or it's not as accessible. as
Accessible.
dilutive.
Right.
And a lot of times more restrictive.
Yes, you have to have specialized skills and knowledge and how to write grants and how to provide enough information, but I mean, it's painful.
Well, it's harder to, it's definitely harder to get, but it's there's a reward for it being that difficult. I mean, it's
Yeah, I've heard of some really early stage biotech companies doing really well.
Mhm.
It did take them that extra year or
Yeah.
two to get that grant,
Yep.
but then at least when
too.
they, you know, went and did their research, they were able to present to their first founders that they had a really clean cap table, right? So. Yeah.
A lot
And so-
of academic founded startups
Yeah, or that way. Yeah.
get started with
With
2 to
grants.
3 years of non-dilutive funding.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we have
They
experience
get-
writing grants is
Yeah,
why.
they get in the game.
Yep.
And once you're in the game, you stay.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
just hard getting in the game at the right time.
That's right.
Other questions? Any other questions we have just a couple more minutes. If there's any more questions. Oh, I see some in the chat. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention to the chat. Yeah. Triggers for moving from pre-seed to Series A. Triggers for moving from pre-seed to Series A.
Yeah, the number one is you're running out of money.
There's a trigger,
And I
right?
often tell people, right, like, let's say your runway that you've imagined is 6 months. Really at month 3, you should already be thinking about how you're gonna get your next one, right? And that's the toughest thing I think about being a founder that's following this trajectory is like, you do the way it's built, like you do your Series A, it's supposed to last you a certain amount of time, then you're supposed to do your Series B, that's supposed to last you a certain amount of time, then you do your Series C. So it's a lot on the founder to keep fundraising, but you know, the idea is you should be thinking about your next fundraise well before you're in crunch mode. So let's say you've got convertible notes, right? And they're maturing in December and you're like, oh, I don't have the capital to pay these back, right? So by like 6 months before that, or 3 months before that, you should be thinking, hey, am I going to extend these? Am I going to convert these? Like, what am I going to do with these? So you should already be having those conversations before you're in any kind of a dangerous situation or place.
One more question. Can you like just recap the difference between dilution and non-dilution funding? Because every time I hear dilution, I'm thinking trademark dilution. It's just totally off.
Yeah, so non-dilutive funding means that no one is going on your cap table, meaning they're not getting any equity. So a grant, for example, is like a good example of non-dilutive funding, because they're like, here, take this $2 million, but I'm not getting any ownership of your company. Whereas dilutive funding is anytime someone expects, whether it's now or in the future, ownership of your company in exchange for that funding. So they're like, okay, here, take the 2 million, but this means that I'm owed 10% in your company. That's
Just
the diluted.
think
funding.
of something very concentrated, and you don't want to dilute it to make it, to make it less concentrated. That's essentially what you're doing, is diluting it. Anyways, thank you all. Any other questions? I think we're just about out of time. So just to let everybody know, the workshops are available. You can find, you'll be able to see this recording on our YouTube channel within typically about 24 to 48 hours. You should be able to see it on our YouTube channel at the Rec Innovation Lab. And is it okay if a couple of people have asked me if we can share some of these slides?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
So then
yes. You
the
guys
slides
can-
will be there.
And my contact information is here. Please email me. My LinkedIn isn't here, but you can find me on LinkedIn. Please connect with me. Yes.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Sorry to make you
Yeah.
hard time finding this.
Oh, sorry about that.
Did you talk about one?
I did not. I haven't talked about options or warrants. Tried to keep it pretty high level. But yes, options and warrants are other examples of ways you can issue equity, different kinds of equity.
And maybe we'll stick around for a couple minutes if people, if
Yeah,
that's okay, just a couple minutes. All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you
Yeah,
all.
I have a
for being
question.
Online, I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording there, and we will see everybody again soon. Bye, everyone.
I have a question about